To Bharat Mandapam for discussions on investing today for a more resilient tomorrow. We start day 2 with a fascinating session. We have Suhasini Haider, the diplomatic editor of The Hindu, in conversation with Ambassador Eric Garcetti and Mr. Kamal Kishore, member and head of department at India's NDMA. Suhasini Haider is the diplomatic editor of The Hindu, one of India's oldest and most respected national dailies in India. She regularly writes on foreign policy issues and hosts a weekly online show, Worldview with Suhasini Haider. Prior to this, Suhasini was foreign affairs editor and primetime anchor for India's leading 24-hour English news channel, CNN IBN, and correspondent for CNN International's New Delhi bureau. She has won numerous awards during the course of her 28-year reporting career and has covered some of the most challenging stories in India and internationally, as well as contributing to a number of books focusing on Indian foreign policy and South Asia. So, Suhasini, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, David, and thank you, ICDRI, for bringing us all together this morning. It is early, but we're glad to see everyone looking quite enthusiastic about this session to follow. It's an unusual session because I'm the non-expert in the room. But it's great to see you, and please do, if you have questions, we're going to try and keep time at the end for it, so please do let us know towards the end. It's a good thing we're indoors and air-conditioned, because if we stepped out right now to have this conversation, it would last about 5 minutes. But we are looking at new record highs when it comes to the heat. We're looking at record fires, floods, earthquakes around the world. And we're looking in a second layer of problems, and I'm echoing, you know, at a time when the past is no precedent. Today's disasters are showing us that it is not possible to gauge the intensity of the next disaster or contingency depending on the past, because new record levels are being touched every year. The third layer, if you like, is climate change. It's an acknowledged reality now, something we can all feel, and it's raising the question that is year on year with global warming going to just get worse. And finally, there are the problems of the developing world. We in India feel it much more strongly. The idea that development is the need of the day, and yet the need to construct buildings, roads, dams, bridges are creating their own perhaps stepping stone to disasters. So what we have on this session are 2 experts, but what's really great is they're 2 hands-on practitioners on resilience and management. Ambassador Garcetti is the United States ambassador to India since May 2023, but from 2013 to 2022, he was the mayor of Los Angeles. One of America's biggest cities in one of US's most disaster-prone states, I think, because we always hear about disasters in California, whether it's the earthquake, fault lines, forest fires, severe flooding. In 2018, he released a document called Resilient Los Angeles, mandating the strategy planning for disaster resilience. So I'm going to hope to speak to him a bit about that. Mr. Kamal Kishore is Member Secretary of the National Disaster Management Authority in India, which is one of the 10 most disaster-prone countries in the world. And I say this with a smile, I don't know why. Before this, he was at the UNDP working on regional disaster risk reduction. And at the NDMA, of course, he's worked on India's disaster preparation, as well as the development of the ICDRI itself. So he's someone very well known to you. But next month, and I'm giving no secrets away, he will take over as the United Nations Assistant Secretary General and Special Representative of the Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction. So this is why I can't think of 2 better people in this city today to have this conversation with. And I'm going to try and break up this conversation a little bit in terms of their expertise. Disaster resilience at the city, at the national level, at the regional level, bilateral cooperation, and multilateral strategizing. Ambassador Garcetti, if I could start with you and just ask you, what made you draw up the plan, of course, part of the 100 resilient cities in the US plan, and what were the key features that you had to look at when dealing with the city?
Well, first of all, thank you for joining us and being our moderator today. It's always a joy to be with you. And Kamal, it's great to be on the stage with you. And Amit, congratulations on the extraordinary work we're coming out of. As I was saying at our breakfast, we're the immediate past co-chair, which is a great title to have because it sounds prestigious with no more responsibilities. But we are 100% still as engaged in CDRI. And I love coming here not only as ambassador of my nation, but also as a former local leader. 21 years that I spent in what is really a municipality of about 20 million people, municipal area. And you mentioned it, but I thought I'd just list it. In the United States, we officially have 18 different disasters that we can face, and 14 of them can happen in Los Angeles. Only cold wave, avalanche, ice storm, and winter extremities is not a vulnerability yet. But you'd be surprised to know Los Angeles is vulnerable for volcanoes, wildfires, tornadoes, floods, heat waves, hail, hurricanes, droughts, earthquakes, coastal flooding, river flooding, tsunami, strong wind, landslide, and lightning. So that's just a normal day as mayor. You don't know what's going to come. And I always say that leadership is defined not by what you set out to do and how well you do it, but what you don't expect to happen and how well you react to it. Think about the pandemic. Think about the disasters that we're talking about here. It is defining for a country, it's defining for a city. And I think most political leaders often do things in the wake of disaster, which is why this coalition is so important too. And one of the things I try to do as mayor is be the first Los Angeles mayor who didn't strengthen our greatest threat that has caused the most damage, although fires come close, earthquakes, and not wait until the next big one to change our laws. So we looked kind of comprehensively at what we could do first to strengthen our earthquake laws, wood-framed buildings, retrofitting, and older concrete buildings. An immensely expensive thing that no property owner wants to be told by government that she or he has to do. But we engaged with national government, seconded some national authorities from our U.S. Geological Survey into City Hall for the first time ever, and scientists, so that we're guided by science to put forward something, and conversations with engineers, property owners, to put forward the strongest earthquake retrofitting ordinance in the United States history. That led us to the Rockefeller Foundation coming to us when 100 resilient cities, including ones here in India, a project of Rockefeller Foundation was to, can we plan ahead and use this new term, resilience? Because I think if we're honest with each other, the average, and translate it into your respective language, but the average resident on the street has no idea what resilience means. It sounds like something like personal, you can be strong and resilient in the face of challenge, which it is, but we have to really humanize what we're talking about. Your home, your neighborhood, your school, your building, your streets, your computer, your telephone, your power, your water. That's what we're talking about. And obviously your well-being when it comes to heat. And so we put together the first resilient city plan for Los Angeles. Rockefeller called it the best in the world when we published it. And it led us also to hiring a chief resiliency officer, which again, a lot of people said, why do you need that? You have a fire chief, you have a police chief, you have people who take care of the electricity system. But to have one person thinking ahead of disaster and to plan, the last point I'll make, not just government response, but I'll pick up where Dr. Mishra left off downstairs. This is about community preparedness. The great force multiplier in New Delhi is not the tens of thousands of municipal workers here. It's 20 million people that live here. And if they know what to do in the face of a disaster, government can fill the holes, can direct aid, can bring in international partnerships while the people rebuild their lives and protect themselves in their own neighborhoods first.
So I have my own LA story. I was in LA pre-1994, after which I think all jokes ceased. But I was there for an earthquake and was planning to go to Disneyland the next day. So we called up to ask if it would be open, given that there'd been a bad earthquake that day. And they said, yes, everything works, but the earthquake simulator machine, which was meant as a joke because when you went in to the earthquake simulator, you thought it was new. I mean, it was really happening. So you talked about the idea of CROs. Mr. Kamal Kishore, do you think the idea of CROs is going to catch on? Is it something we're going to learn from Ambassador Garcetti's plan?
Oh, absolutely. I think if there's any chance of succeeding in building resilience and reducing risk, it really has to be at that level. City level, neighborhood level, even further down. I think building local capacity is really the essence of all our resilience building efforts. There is a lot of celebration of India's success in reducing cyclone-related mortality. We often talk about how our climate forecast, our weather forecast of cyclone track, its timing of landfall has improved. But perhaps we don't talk enough about the investment we've made at the community level in getting communities ready to respond to the warning. Any early warning system assumes that there is somebody being warned and that somebody knows what to do with it. So I think that's our success in cyclone risk reduction really rests on communities. And of course, everything else is important, but the most critical piece is getting it right at the local level.
So I'm interested by that because both of you seem to suggest that it's a bottom-up approach that actually works better. But there's a sense also that the big picture sometimes gets lost. And the reason I say this is because, of course, it's important to have communities involved and all the rest. But centralized plans that go into place when nothing remains on the ground, I'm talking about post-cyclone Orissa or post the tsunamis or other, major disasters we've seen. What we've seen is it's so difficult to rebuild communities. Why has it been so difficult in India particularly to get into the idea of, major insurance packages, have people preemptively plan for these kind, and as you said, cyclones, I think the Bay of Bengal is one of the most cyclone-prone zones of the world.
So I think traditionally, over the last many decades, the focus, not just in India, but globally, has been primarily on immediate response. In other words, to make it very clear, on distributing biscuits and blankets and not building houses and local markets. So in the last decade or 15, 20 years, there has been much greater emphasis on how do we rebuild? Earlier this morning, we were having a breakfast, and there was a reference made to owner-driven reconstruction. So, of course, you need institutional structures, but you really need to have institutional structures that are not top-down, which empower communities to be not subjects of intervention, but drivers of recovery. And that requires that the way you structure finance, the way you structure facilities for providing technical assistance, it really targets that level. What we learned from reconstruction in Gujarat, what we learned from reconstruction after 2008 Kosi floods, we applied that in collaboration with our Nepali counterparts in rebuilding Nepal after the 2015 earthquake. And it is one of the best earthquake reconstruction programs I've ever seen. We built 50,000 houses, and all the money went directly to the households with some socio-technical facilitation, sorry to use the jargon. The key benefit is, of course, the houses, but also the employment it generated. We created 900 women masons, so they have a job, they are empowered, they are participants in the resilience building story of those communities. So it's really this, that we need to have institutional frameworks to support rebuilding and reconstruction, but focus really has to be at the local level and not a contractor-driven top-down approach to recovery.
And thank you for bringing in the Nepal earthquake reconstruction program. Ambassador Garcetti, your thoughts on the kind of balance in financing when it comes to doing the pre-disaster sort of disaster mitigation reduction kind of thing, and what you deal with, as Mr. Kamal Kishore said, the tents and blankets. Do you think both at the global level and at the national levels, we are financing this right? In other words, we're putting as much into the tents and blankets as we are into averting the kind of disasters. Because as people always say, earthquakes don't kill people, buildings kill people. And the idea that that's going in, and I ask particularly because, of course, Los Angeles is going to see an Olympics coming up. I'm sure there's a lot more planning that goes into what's, as you said, 14 different kinds of disasters there. Do you think we're getting the finance mix right?
I think we're getting it better, but I think if I can be provocative, between national and, leadership and international cooperation, and then local and community-driven leadership, there's something to learn from both levels from each other. Right now, national and international leadership moves slowly with ideas. CDRI, I think, is been formed to try to change that, to bring more to light speed the ideas that I might get from Dominican Republic, or that I might learn from Cuba, or that I might hear from Tonga or some other country out there, and to be able to share that from the United States to other countries like India, France, so that we have that more quickly being disseminated. And national governments kind of top down right now are the ones who say, this is how we're going to rebuild. When in reality, it's the bottom up that is always rebuilt. And I'll give you an example, because I think all of us forget what we've just lived through, which is the worst pandemic of our lifetimes. And there's a lot of parallel lessons. We shouldn't turn our heads away from the trauma of what we learned, because there was a lot of lessons as well. But I remember as chair of C40, the group of the 100 largest cities of the world, it's a climate action group that I chaired. And it was the second Zoom call. Nobody knew what a Zoom call was, but I remember this was the only network of big city mayors in the world. And so suddenly it was the second or first week of the pandemic, and I said, let's try to do a conference call across every time zone of the world. I think we had 70 of 100 mayors, if you can imagine that. So the mayor of Tokyo and the mayor or governor of Tokyo, the mayor of Seoul, the mayor, we had mayors here from India, from Melbourne, from, Freetown, from Mexico City, from Buenos Aires. The list went on and on. And we immediately started talking to each other. The mayor of Seoul told us what drive-through testing was. Nobody knew what drive-through testing was for a disease. The mayor of Milan, because remember North Italy had the peak at that time, said this is how you can start getting your hospital ready so that fewer people will die while they're waiting in the hallways. And immediately we started implementing that. Now Mayor Khan of London shared with me a year later that he went to Boris Johnson, you remember him, Boris Johnson, to share this story. And as a national leader, Boris Johnson said to his cabinet, do we know all this stuff? Drive-through testing, what to do with hospitals? They said, yes, sir. We're compiling all of that. We'll have a report in the next couple of weeks. When you read that report, you can start calling international leaders, and within a month or two, you guys can start sharing this information. While meanwhile, cities were already doing it the next day. And I think it's a lesson for us here, too, that communities have lessons to teach us. So we, at the international, national level, have to be much quicker at sharing ideas. And at the local level, I think we have to invert ourselves too, to empowering ourselves to realize we will be the ones who rebuild. And the financing really needs to flow to communities who can make the best decisions for themselves.
Sure. Mr. Kishore, the sequitur to that is the internet is everywhere, everyone gets information, and yet there's also a lot of misinformation, panic. How does one, in a sense, panic-proof the disaster resilience process?
I think there are, the first thing is that from the institutional perspective, from the institutions of the government, organizations such as mine, I think they really have to be forward-leaning. Sometimes we are too shy to share information. We really have to be forward-leaning and engage. The best example in recent times is how we communicated on what was happening when we were dealing with Silkyara tunnel collapse. So once you are transparent and you share information about what is happening, what do we know, what are the steps being taken, what is the kind of cooperation we want from public, it is not always an adversarial thing. There is also potential for collaboration. So if we communicate that, I think that preempts a lot of the unnecessary panic. The second thing is that some of us who work on disaster risk management, we have to really get out of the jargons and get better at communicating in a language, sharing information in a language that is understandable, actionable, usable. And in that, I think there is a lot of dialogue required. So, sometimes, if you are planning I'll give you the example of the current general elections. So general elections are happening, they always happen, at the time when we have peak summers. So we need to share information on what is the heat wave scenario for the coming season. But when you engage in a discussion with the commission, then you realize what is their information requirement. They say, well, month is fine, but tell me 5 days before the event, what is going to happen in these constituencies so that we can take measures. So you were working on a seasonal forecast. They want a 5-day forecast, but with greater precision. So when you have this dialogue between user and producer of information on risk, you come up with something which is actionable, usable, understandable. And then you preempt the panic, and you pursue the whole issue of reducing losses, being prepared with a greater sense of determination and some humility as well.
Well, certainly. And in fact, when we say now the election campaign is heating up, it's not a political statement anymore. But what's interesting to me is the idea, even a few years ago, that the National Disaster Management Authority would be sitting on a stage with the Election Commission, and then there are these pictures of them actually figuring out where they're going to go next with that. It's also interesting that you spoke about the Silkyara Tunnel, because what we saw is, in fact, as you said, you were sharing information, transparent information, real time, and that brought in international cooperation as well. We saw international experts there. Eventually, though, it was the traditional, the rat hole workers who were able to bring the workers out safely. What does that tell you really about that mix? Because in India, we often see it. There's all these top-down authorities that work on a project, but it's eventually the traditional measures that come to the fore.
No, I think in our pursuit of resilience, no technology, no knowledge is too humble or too advanced. Whatever works. So I would not, promote indigenous knowledge as a panacea to all problems, or promote technology as a panacea to all problems. I think both have their place, and we really have to. I think as long as the focus is on achieving results, we have the story of cyclone-related mortality is really instructive. There is a clear determination that we want zero mortality, whatever it takes.
All right. Let's move to the bilateral level then, given all your experiences. How do you find US and India really being able to cooperate with each other, or is it just about how much funding and how many specific projects you can do?
No, I mean, from the tactical level to the strategic level, it has never been as deep a relationship and as meaningful one. We've been so honored to co-chair CDRI together. It's really gotten into the culture of American government. So it's not just in our bilateral relationship, but as I always say, this multiplicative relationship of India times the US, not just India plus the US, which I know a lot of other countries could say about their relationship with India too, really helps us to change values and perspectives. So for us, it's everything that we're doing from engaging on specific work together, but it's also what I call geometric diplomacy. It's the trilateral, quadrilateral level, where, for instance, the trilateral development cooperation that we're doing, something called TriDep. It's a program to basically, it's a partnership to take US and Indian know-how and take third countries and bring people in for training. We've done it now with Fiji, for instance. Fiji, where 74%, I think, of the population is vulnerable to disaster, and great telemedicine and psychosocial training. It's the largest training of Fijian professionals outside of Fiji ever. Happened right here in Delhi as a partnership between the Ministry of External Affairs and USAID. Now we did that with the Philippines just last week. We finished that training. And it's a great example we can go to. We're talking about going to Africa together, other places where we're learning things that are good for the US. I know India is learning things that's good for India, while we're also teaching and sharing and learning from third countries. So to us, this is really about changing the international approach to climate disaster preparedness. It's looking at the community level of the tactical ways that we can engage more quickly. And I think that for us, whether it's looking at curriculum development, which we're doing with our Indian Institutes of Technology, and I think this is a huge point, by the way, for everybody in their countries, put this in the curriculums of higher education and even secondary education, because even those of us in this room who are talking about it, how many of us actually have a plan for our home right here in Delhi? Especially the diplomats. Well, I'm sure our embassy will take care of it or something. But do you know the plan to call your children, for them to call you across borders? So I see one hand up, so that's great. So I'm glad you're planned ahead. But it's one of these things where I once asked disaster professionals, do you do the same things we preach to others? But this bilateral relationship is really calling us to think at the highest levels and also at the most grassroots levels in the most rewarding way. And we can't wait to keep doing that work across the world. I think it shows the power, as we saw in G20, U.S. can open certain doors that sometimes are not as open to India. India opens doors to us that aren't as open to the United States. So when they see us locking arms together, there's really few places in the world that we can't learn from, but also teach important lessons to as well.
All right. When it comes to the heat, for example, are there lessons to be shared?
Absolutely. We're working, for instance, with India right now on energy efficient HVAC, air conditioning systems. We did a competition. John Kerry, who was our special envoy for climate, looked at the most efficient air conditioners in the world that would use the least energy, mitigate people's suffering while not contributing to it even more. And India had the best technology. And so now we're looking at, is this something that India can manufacture for itself and for the world, for us? We're doing things, of course, in climate mitigation throughout the country. Our Development Finance Corporation now funds everything from buildings to vehicles to electricity to some of the mitigation on the coastline. And India is the #1 country of the DFC. 10% of our book of business is here in India. So if you have ideas to the Indian audience here of things that you need financing for that's in this space, we've got a ready, willing, excited partner in DFC. There's no country, I think the second biggest country is a quarter of what we're doing here in India alone.
All right. Mr. Kishore, what has your experience really been? Because there is a sense, of course, that India and the US work together very seamlessly on so many fronts, but eventually these are perhaps regional issues that one has to deal with, regional issues where multilateral organizations are more important, the World Bank is more important, the UN is more important. Within the region, we see this SIDS is coming up, the small island developing states. We've seen, FIPIC countries, Pacific countries take their own case to the UN for climate justice. For example, there's the Climate Vulnerable Fund countries, forum countries that are also working differently. Where do you think, actually, India's future focus is really going to be? Is it on the bilaterals? Is it on the multilaterals? And how's the CDRI experience really brought it together?
I think it's all of those. I think it's working with close partners such as the US in other countries, doing a trilateral cooperation, working with regional institutions such as BIMSTEC, working with international organizations. But let me talk a little bit about where is the emerging and even more well-defined niche of CDRI in this whole process. I think the first thing is that we can offer from CDRI a different model of engagement with countries where we start from where they are. So it's not a fly in an expert, give some knowledge and fly out. It's really accompanying them in their resilience journey and aspiring to achieve some sort of a transformative impact. We are not, the CDRI, the name infrastructure is there in its name. The word infrastructure is there in its name, but it's not building infrastructure. So it doesn't have any infrastructure projects. So it can go beyond project level thinking to national level thinking of transformation. How do you get your systems right? How do you use tools and products such as the GIRI model to reimagine futures infrastructure at the national level and work from there? So it's really a sort of a more comfortable approach of accompanying countries in their resilience journey, and in that process, facilitating a lot of peer-to-peer exchange. It's one thing to fly in a power sector expert and give a lot of, in Hindi you would call it gyan, high, deep knowledge on how to make power sector resilient. It is quite another thing to take one power sector utility manager from one country to another country and have him sit alongside his colleague from another country and share his challenges, his sense of determination, his learning, his pain points, and really facilitate that sort of, for want of a better word, a comfortable way of working together and really accompanying them in, a more resilient future.
In fact, I think there's a cross-border trade in electricity session at this conference, which should actually look at some of these issues, because of course most people forget, they're looking at restoring, say, roads, and electricity, but it's really also communication restoration that's important. I want to come to audience questions, so please do keep them ready. But before that, I want you both to maybe speak about your passion project. What is the one project you implemented that works? And the reason I ask this is I did cover the 2004 tsunami quite extensively, and I remember two communities that actually escaped the worst of the tsunami. One community was in the Andaman Islands, where Karnik was one of the worst affected islands, but they were essentially tribal communities, still very much in touch with their tribal traditions. And when they saw the animals go up towards the top of the hills, they went as well. And as a result, they were saved. Eventually, the real problem for them was starvation, although there were some things to eat on the top of the mountains, and the challenge was airdropping food. But they did survive. The other community was a community on the shores of I think, just Pondicherry. And there was a village over there that had become a pilot project for computer education and computer literacy for fishermen. So the fishermen of that village had already gone and looked at tidal waves, because they used to go every day to look at them to see where the fish populations were. And they were looking at satellite information, and they were able to stay back. And I thought it was so interesting that one at one end of the technology spectrum and one at right the other were the two communities I saw that were most resilient, most well prepared for this horrible, horrible disaster. So very quickly, Ambassador Garcetti, what's your passion project? What's your favorite project?
That's a great point. It's always the poorest that already every day live with resilience and know how to be the most resilient in a disaster. I think it's when I was mayor, we looked at, I'll do two very quickly. One was our aqueduct. Many of you may know the history of Los Angeles is we had to bring water from elsewhere. And it crosses a tunnel, or there's a tunnel that crosses our largest fault line 18 different times. And so in a big earthquake, our water supply will be cut off. And so we looked at how we could create a resilient tunnel, and we're retrofitting the tunnels that cross that so that it can go with an earthquake and water won't be cut off for months and basically cause 1 million plus people to move out of Los Angeles. Second was using cell phone bandwidth. We got every single company to say in a disaster immediately we'll share bandwidth. So if you're a customer of this company, you can use that if that's the only signal that you have. And that was the first time that had ever been done with competitors across borders. And I'll sneak in a third one. The first early warning system on cell phones in America for earthquakes, which is something we learned from Mexico and we learned from Japan. So again, this trading of ideas helps people a lot. You have to install a lot of sensors to make it happen, but it will save more lives than we'll ever be able to count when people have as much as a minute or two warning before the big earthquake actually comes to their home.
All right. Mr. Kishore?
It's tough to pick one favorite. I have many favorites, but since you talked about the tsunami one, so the village that you talked about is called Samyarpetai. And besides the work on technology, just a couple of months before the tsunami, we had done a project there to prepare them for cyclones and do community-level organization on how the community will organize itself in the event of a cyclone, how they will evacuate, where they will evacuate, who will do the first aid, who will provision for food, and so on. They had prepared for a cyclone. What happened was a tsunami. But the disaster that happens is not the one you had planned for. But if you have planned for it, you will come out better. So, in disaster risk management, they say that the plan is nothing, planning is everything. So the process of going through, development of a scenario about what could happen and how you would respond to that, makes you a lot more resilient and you come out a lot better.
Yeah, I think the drills are the most important part of everything you've said. Could I see with a show of hands questions that are going to go out? And we have people from absolutely every part of the world, so I'd love for you to also share some of your experiences, if you'd like. I'm going to go to the lady first, and then I'll come to you. Can we get a mic over here?
There.
Right there, the lady in the blue jacket. Yeah.
Hi, good morning. Kathy Boffman-McLeod, CEO of Climate Resilience for All. I wanted to ask a question about narrative. In the Ambassador Garcetti, you listed 14, 20 disasters that face Los Angeles. The narrative is changing about disasters. It's becoming more mainstream. I wanted to ask both of you, how has your narrative about this changed?
All right. And can I just take the question from the gentleman there as well? Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity to ask the question. I am Pratik Arora, one of the CDRI fellow coming from New York University. So my question to Ambassador Garcetti, could you please talk more about possibility and prospects going forward in the future about the US-India collaboration on disaster-resilient infrastructure?
All right. Each
Sure.
of you.
Well, let me start with that one. I detailed a lot of the work that USAID and other agencies are doing right now, and we really focus on capacity. India is such a large country. I think the challenge for all of us, even big countries, is how do you make an impact? And I think it's when you change your mindset that you don't come to teach and to preach, but to listen and learn. And so I think we're gathering as much from India in this relationship as we're bringing to. For instance, being with Sewa, the organization that has 40,000 chapters here, and listening to a construction worker in Gujarat who's talking about in the hottest days, even with gloves on, she can't hold the bricks that her livelihood depends on. So how do we adapt and really think about this as jobs resilience as well, as something that we've learned a lot on. So I think I've detailed a lot of the other ways that we're doing stuff, from educational curriculum development to one other thing I didn't mention, the South Asia Energy Database, which is a way to share and to help South Asian countries across borders when one is having disaster, free up electricity or water to another part of South Asia, and to think regionally and to really break things down across borders. In terms of the narrative, how's the narrative changed? I would say I don't know as much. The narrative changes all the time. I could answer that, but let me say one of the lessons I learned as mayor during the pandemic was within the narrative is to move people from objects to subjects. And one of the best pieces of advice somebody gave me during a disaster was stop telling people what's happening and what the government's doing, and let them know what they need to be doing today. Because it's not just a force multiplier, it's not just engaging a larger group of people in rebuilding and responding, but it's also gives people a psychology and an emotional space to not be so desperate. You actually save lives when people don't give up hope. And I think that's the most important change in the narrative.
And stop panicking, really. There was actually a study on how the washing hands routine during the pandemic actually brought down a lot of the panic levels. I'm not sure it helped that much. Mr. Kishore, would you like to talk a bit about the narrative as well?
So on the narrative, I can say three things. Number one is that it has become a central development issue of our time. The issues related to, we no longer just list the hazards, but what it means for our lives and livelihoods. It's a central development issue of our times. The second thing is that there is a lot more determination now compared to even 5 years ago everywhere. I think we have jettisoned the natural from natural disaster. There are no natural disasters. They're all man-made, human-made. And the third thing is that much greater appreciation that there is a lot of uncertainty in the global system, and we have to build resilience not just to what we know, but also we perhaps do not fully know and appreciate. Just to close this, in India, the money for disaster risk management is allocated in a large measure by Finance Commission, which is constituted every 5 years. The previous Finance Commission, they used to have a chapter on disaster management. Now they have a chapter on disaster risk management. Just insertion of that word shows that the narrative in the national policy discourse has changed.
All right, and you're dealing with a lot less climate denial, so I guess disaster denial is as well not as much of an issue, we hope. I hope you found this an instructive session. I certainly learned a lot from it, but I'd like a round of applause for our guests. Thank you very much, and it's over to you, David.
Great, thank you very much. Can we get a group photo? And just while that happens, everyone who has read Supporting Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, this year, rather than flowers, rather than gifts for our speakers, we are investing in one mangrove for each of them, and they will receive a certificate so they can geolocate and check it. So just while I pass those out, please give another round of applause for our fantastic panel.